All right, I want to welcome those who are joining us tonight, watching this from YouTube, the Moorhead Church of Christ Wednesday evening Bible study. We are continuing our study in the book of Job, and we will be in chapter 16. So if you have a Bible and want to start turn there, that's where we're going to be studying tonight. So we know that Job is a man of God. Job is a man who is dedicated to living for God. We know that Job was somebody that wanted to be pleasing to God in all things. And yet, going back to the very beginning, we recognize that there was this conversation between God and the devil, or Satan, and the conversation pretty much was, well, the only reason why Satan is telling God, the only reason why that Job follows you is because you bless him, because you protect him. And Satan essentially says, listen, if you take away all of his wealth, all of his blessings, he's going to curse your name. And of course, God said, you can go ahead and do that, but don't take his life. And so Satan essentially removes his family. All of his family are killed. All of his wealth is gone. And Job does not curse the name of God. Then Satan goes before God again and says, well, the reason why Job didn't turn from you is because nothing affected him personally. But if you afflict his body, then he will curse your name. And of course, God tells him, well, go ahead and do that. Just don't take his life. And Satan does that. And what we see is that Satan is not omniscient. If he was, he would have known that this would have never worked. And he should have just been reminded by his creator that God would know these things. The only thing with the book of Job is that even though Job is a righteous man, he's a godly man, he is not privileged to be able to hear this conversation between God and Satan. And so without any kind of information from God, he has no idea why all of a sudden he went from being such a prosperous man to losing everything. So he has three friends that come from afar to visit him, and they're supposed to be there to sort of comfort him and encourage him. And they're all convinced, as what was typically believed at the time, is that the reason why Job is suffering is because he sinned. Well, Job probably believed the same thing until this happened to him. But then he realized, seeing that he was a righteous man, that he turned away from sin, that he atoned for his sin after he repented for it, that this could not be true in every situation, because he was a godly man and there was no sin for which he didn't essentially make it good before God. And so he's been trying to tell his friends, listen, you don't understand what I'm trying to tell you. You don't get it, that I'm a righteous man, I'm innocent, and you shouldn't be accusing me of evil doing and think that I've sinned. And this is really a lot of these speeches. This is pretty much the gist of the speeches, is this back and forth between Job and his friends. Job's really claiming his innocence, promoting his innocence, and his friends essentially saying, Job, the reason why you're suffering is because you sinned. So we're picking up in chapter 16, but just a quick summary of chapter 15. Eliphaz, one of the friends, in assuming Job's guilt of sin, told him that he stood self-condemned. He accused Job of being prideful and denying his sin, and in explaining the ways of God which were different than how the ancients understood them to be. Eliphaz finished his speech describing the wicked and their end in hopes of encouraging Job to repent. So we'll begin in Job 16, and if I can get a volunteer to read the first 5 verses.
I can do it.
You want to read that, Brian?
Yeah.
Okay.
Then Job answered, I have heard many such things. Sorry comforters are you all. Is there no limit to windy words, or what plagues you that you answered? I too could speak like you. If I were in your place, I could compose words against you and shake my head at you. I could strengthen you with my mouth, and the solace of my lips could lessen your pain.
All right, very good. So Unfortunately, Eliphaz has accused Job of not only being unrighteous, but also a hypocrite in his speech to Job in chapter 15. Now it's Job's turn to speak to him and to set the record straight. It appears that in chapters 16 and 17, that Job is moving away from just responding to his friend's accusations against him to recognizing that God alone knows the reason for his suffering, and it is not because of sin. So let's begin verses 1 and 2. He says, Then Job answered, I have heard many such things. Sorry comforters are you all. And so we think about what he says here. I've heard many things. And this is really talking about the words that Eliphaz's speech, in his speech, that he used to really condemn and to correct Job. In other words, Job has said, I've heard similar things like this before that you've sort of said to me here, and this is really nothing new. And so we look at sort of how Job refers to Eliphaz and his friends. What does Job think of his three friends that came from the distance they did to come to sort of be there for Job in his moment of need?
Basically saying, you haven't given me any comfort.
He calls them sorry comforters. In other words, when we look at that, sorry here, the Hebrew word here is sort of the idea of trouble, but it's really bringing out the idea of lacking in usefulness or value. The New International Version, Amplified Bible, King James Version calls them miserable comforters. In other words, you guys haven't been comforters at all. You guys have not said, hey, we really feel bad for you and all this stuff that you're going through. I've been talking to you and you guys really aren't showing any sympathy at all. So, of what value are you guys to me if you came here to comfort me and you don't give me any comforter? And Job said something similar to this in Job chapter 13 and verse 4, when Job called his three friends in that verse worthless physicians. And so the idea is you came here, probably with the goal of giving me comfort, but you really haven't helped me. You haven't given any comfort to me at all. And so here these guys came to be comforters, but they really failed to do the job as some who would to give comfort in a time of need, which Job could have desperately used, the idea of giving him encouragement and support in his great suffering. Okay, and the reason why they didn't give him the comfort that he was looking for is because they thought Job was guilty of sin, and so really the suffering is God sort of punishing him. And so they didn't really feel that maybe that was appropriate to do in light of the situation. In verse 3, Job continues his speech to Eliphaz. He says, is there no limit to windy words? And so he says, or what plagues you that you answer? And so the idea, is there no limit or end to windy words? And when we look at this, what does that draw in your mind in terms of what he's saying? His windy words, what is he talking about?
Like words that mean nothing.
Okay, so they really seem to be the idea of they're lacking substance. And I liked what the New International Version says here. Instead of windy words, it says, he talks about there's no limit to long-winded speeches. In other words, you're talking, you're saying a lot of things, but you know what? It really isn't doing any good. You're just saying a bunch of words. And, Job is sort of thinking about, all that Eliphaz has said. Remember, when we studied chapter 15, he had 35 verses, so that's a pretty long verse. Job's first speech here in chapter 16 is 22 verses. So Eliphaz felt like he had a number of things to enlighten Job with. And so he went on exhaustively to explain all these things. And the second part of verse 3 here, he talks about, or what plagues, Job says, what plagues you that you answer? And so Job wonders why Eliphaz speaks to him in a manner as he's done. In other words, Job really deserved better. And, he seems to try to be schooling Job and really sort of trying to correct him. And again, Job knows he's a righteous man, and the author of Job has made it clear that he is a righteous man. And yet, in the eyes of his friends, he's being treated as if he is somebody who is really a wicked man. And he deserves really better than what he has received from them. Any questions about those first couple verses? Okay. Let's go on to verse 4. Job continues speaking there to Eliphaz. He says, I too could speak like you if I were in your place. I could compose words against you and shake my head at you. And so when we look at this verse, what do you think Job is trying to tell Eliphaz here?
Don't judge, because I could judge you in the same manner.
Okay, that's pretty close. Bless you.
Basically, it sounds like he's saying, like, you know, you're basically just accusing me.
Yeah.
And if I was in your shoes, I could accuse you.
Okay, so this is really the gist of it. He says, you know, if the tables were turned, you were sort of in my shoes, I was in your shoes, and I could essentially say the same things to you. I could make windy speeches accusing you of being a sinner, and then shake my head at you. And Jeremiah 48 and verse 27, Matthew 7 verse 39, the idea of shaking your head is sort of the idea of mocking. In other words, shaking your head and really disapproval. Job is not saying that I would do the same to you if Eliphaz was in his position and Job was where Eliphaz was. What Job is saying is that Eliphaz, along with his two other friends, lacked true sympathy for him. Eliphaz and the other two friends have not really listened to what Job has been telling them and looking at things differently. In other words, he's been pouring out his heart. He's been trying to maintain a position that he is innocent of what of sin, what they are saying that he has been doing or that he's guilty of, and they really haven't listened to it. All they've essentially done is come back with another speech saying, Job, in essence, you're a sinner. You've done something wrong, because if you're suffering, you're sinning. You've sinned in some way, and God's punishing you for that. So Job is kind of disgusted at his friends and saddened that they have not sort of really listened to what he's had to say. Job says that if he were in their shoes, he would be a true comforter. In other words, he would really reach out and what a comforter would be. And he sort of saw in his friends that they were righteous men as well. Later on in the book, we're going to see that they were not right in condemning Job, but Job is not going to be hanging out with wicked men. These men must have been righteous too. And so the idea is that he would have gave them sort of the benefit of the doubt. If they said that they were innocent, he wouldn't say, well, you're doing this you're suffering, so even though you're telling me you're innocent, I'm not going to believe you. I'm going to believe that you really were guilty of sin and God's punishing you. Verse 5, Job continues. He says, I could strengthen you with my mouth, and solace of my lips could lessen your pain. And so we see here that Job is really saying, I would be there for you. I would not just sort of be going on with these windy speeches and trying to correct you and try to get you to see that you are guilty of some kind of sin that you must have done, but I would act in your best interest. I would be a true comforter to you. And so it reminds us of something of what Jesus said in here. In Matthew 7 and verse 12, Jesus says, therefore, however you want people to treat you, so treat them, for this is the law and the prophets. And the idea is you should have treated me like I would treat you. And we know that this is a quality of Christians. The idea is we don't return evil for evil. We would treat everybody the way that we would want them to be treated. And this is really kind of what we see here in this verse. We would, as Romans chapter 12 and verse 15 talks about, it says, rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. And it seemed like initially, remember when the three friends came to them, that there was 7 days that essentially they all sat there and never spoke a word. They were with Job, and it seemed like that was probably the best comforting they ever did before they opened their mouths. They were there. They didn't say anything. They're just there for him. And as time went on, they're essentially sort of undo really their gesture of really trying to be there to help Job through this difficult time. Any questions about the first 5 verses? Okay, we're going to read the next, we're going to read verses 6 through 17. That's all one group of verses. So I need a volunteer for reading 6 through 11, Jenna. And then Lily, if you want to read 12 through 17. Okay, we'll get through the next big group there.
If I speak, my pain is not lessened, and if I hold back, what has left me? But now he has exhausted me. Thou hast laid waste all my company, and thou hast shriveled me up. It has become a witness, and my leanness rises up against me. It testifies to my face. His anger has torn me and hunted me down. He has gnashed at me with his teeth. My adversary glares at me. They have gaped at me with their mouth. They have slapped me on the cheek with contempt. They have masked themselves against me. God hands me over to ruffians and tosses me into the hands of the wicked.
All was well with me, but he shattered me. He seized me by the neck and crushed me. He has made me his target. His archers surround me. Without pity, he pierces my kidneys and spills my gall on the ground. Again and again, he bursts upon me. He rushes at me like a warrior. I have sewed sackcloth over my skin and buried my brow in the dust. My face is red with weeping. Dark shadows ring my eyes. Yet my hands have been free of violence, and my prayer is pure.
All right, very good. So here we have Job kind of changing gears here a little bit, and he's really going to focus himself not in really addressing Eliphaz, but really talking about his situation with God, and this is the direction he goes. Remember, he's getting frustrated with the friends because he has really spent a lot of time trying to bring them along and try to get them to, think outside the box a little bit. They're confined in this space that means that, if you're suffering, must mean you're sinning. They're confined in that space, and he's trying to get them to realize that, people must suffer for other reasons than just for sin. They must suffer, even the righteous, for a different reason, although Job did not know why he was suffering.
Well, he's making it sound pretty good to his friends that he's pretty helpless right now. That's
Yeah.
what strikes me as.
And that would be all the more for why they should be comforters. The idea is you guys came to comfort me and you haven't done that. I'm trying to figure out why I'm going through this with God, and I'm sort of just here by myself. Remember, Job's family is all gone. All of his children are gone. Most of his servants are gone. And his wife, that should have been in a corner, said to him after he had the suffering fall upon him,
Praise God high.
"Thank you, sweetie. Thanks for helping me out here. I really appreciate it." So he's kind of by himself, and he's trying to sort of figure all this out, and he really doesn't have anybody. So you can sort of see why the friends have sort of, the idea is annoying to him, and he's frustrated with them, and the idea is you really haven't been a benefit to me, and you should have been. We'll pick up here looking at verse 6. He says, "If I speak, my pain is not lessened, and if I hold back, what has left me? And if I hold back, what has left me?" And so right here, Job is saying that, his suffering is not lightened up whether he speaks or he remains silent. So because Job is in great suffering, we know that he had boils all over himself. We know he had sores that were oozing. We know that he was using a piece of broken pottery to itch himself. There are people that believe that Job was suffering from elephantitis, but whatever it was a terrible affliction. And so he has a lot of things going through his mind. Remember, it's affected his sleep. It's affected him in terms of a lot of ways in his life. And so Job doesn't feel that there's of any benefit for him just to sort of suffer in silence. He believes it's advantageous for him really to speak what's on his mind. Verse 7, Job says, "But now," talking about God, "but now he has exhausted me. Thou hast laid waste all my company." So we're going to look at exactly what he means here when he says, but he has exhausted me. What do you think he means, the idea that God has exhausted him?
My Bible says worn me out.
Okay, so the idea that he has made him weary, right? And we think about, well, in what way did God make Job weary? Well, we have to think about where he was before the suffering and where he's at now. Okay, so the idea is that he lost really a lot of his strength. We think about his vitality, the idea that he's been through all of this stuff, so he's suffering emotionally, psychologically. Probably means more so here the idea of weary bodily. He is really a changed man since all of these things have happened to him. And then he says about God, thou hast laid waste all my company. And so does anybody have something that reads different than laid waste all my company as far as the last word company?
This one says household.
Household, okay. So that really kind of brings out a little bit better clarity in terms of what the word means there. Company, the Hebrew word here, means of Job's circle of dependence. And the NIV says my entire household. The Amplified Bible says all of my family and associates. And it seems the idea is all the people that probably would have been in Job's corner to really give him the comfort that he needed now, they're all gone. They're not there.
Pastor, are you talking about like Job's inner circle, like his closest friends and family?
More like
Or are you
more his.
talking about extended?
No, we're probably talking more of his immediate family, and then maybe he includes in there his servants. He had a number of servants working for them. Seems to be all those people, because they would have understood Job was a righteous man just by examining his life. His friends are coming from someplace else to get to him. They understand that Job is a righteous man, but because they think suffering equals sin, that Job must have sinned because he's suffering, they have not taken his position. But that immediate family of his probably would have been the comforters that he needed and could have relied on. Verse 8, Job says, and thou, talking about God, has shriveled me up. It has become a witness, and my leanness rises up against me. It testifies to my face. Okay? So we have to, again, some of the words, remember this is poetry. So the idea that when they're having these speeches, we're thinking this is really different than we would talk sort of in modern times. This is how things would have been done. So the author of Job, it's unknown if it's Job himself. A lot of people believe it's somebody else, but the idea is that they decided to put it in this type of style of writing. So we're forced to sort of look at words and examine them in a way that we would probably not speak ourselves. We probably wouldn't say about God something like, thou hast shriveled me up. So we're left kind of trying to think, Job, what are you talking about? Any ideas what he's talking about?
Kind of like a shell of himself.
Okay, that's a pretty good description. The idea is that it seems to be, that he's looking at his physical self, and you got those before and after pictures, if there's like weight loss, for instance, you might have this really heavy person. This is a before, and then after that you got this real lean person, and there's that big contrast. When I went to Bible college, it was the other way around. I went there looking like the after, and then kind of left looking like the before, because we had donuts they brought in every morning. And but anyway, we're looking at this, and the idea is he has changed, and because God has allowed this great suffering upon Job, it has affected his present physical condition, and Job says that it's evident that this condition is evidence that God is against him, okay? Job's friends see his bodily condition as evidence of the punishment of God for sin. And so the friends see that and say, really, Job, I don't know what you're complaining about, because you're only getting what's coming to you. You've sinned, so God is now punishing you. Job knows that's not true, and yet he's at a loss to really understand why God has allowed all of this to happen to him. And so he's really talking about that condition he's in now. Any questions about verse 8? Now we'll go right into verse 9 there. He says about God, his anger has torn me and hunted me down. He has gnashed me with his teeth. My adversary glares at me. And so we look at what Job is saying here. He's going to use several metaphors to describe God's treatment of him in verses 9 through 14. A metaphor is a figure of speech in which a word or phrase literally denoting one kind of object or idea is used in the place of another to suggest a likeness or an analogy between them. And so sometimes you're going to hear people make this hard push as somebody who believes in the Bible. They're going to say, is the Bible to be taken, all literally or all figuratively? What's the answer?
Literally.
What's that?
I mean, I take it literally.
Okay.
Both.
But is it to be taken 100% literally or 100% figuratively?
Both.
What's that?
Both.
It's somewhere in between, because it's like if I was writing a letter to somebody, if I was writing to Lily and I was away somewhere and I was telling her about things and I said, oh, it was beautiful out, it was sunny, and we were doing this and all this, and then all of a sudden it rained cats and dogs. You go, "Erk." Surely it didn't rain cats and dogs. I mean, not literally. He can't be meaning that literally. So there are times when we sort of recognize, oh, well, this is all literal, but here that's never happened before. That doesn't happen. So he must mean this figuratively. And so the Bible is not really all to be taken literally, or we run into trouble with some of these things, the idea of God, some of the things he says about God, and the idea that God, he's going to talk about God gnashing at his teeth at him and hunting him down and all that. And the idea is we take the Bible literally as much as we can, because that's usually how you would take any writing that you receive. But there comes a point where some things might be said that aren't intended to be taken literally. And this is really one of those examples right here. When he talks about God, he's really putting the focus on God's anger. And when he uses this here, he describes here for Eliphaz really the severe suffering at the hand of God in terms of a wild, ferocious beast attacking him. And Job's suffering has devastated his whole life. And so even though Job was not going to leave God, he's faithful to God, even though he said some pretty hard things, because he's seeing God sort of in a negative light. He's saying things about God. It's not really as a result of disrespecting God, but the idea of is trying to understand God. And so Job is really just sort of giving his feelings. In other words, I'm suffering and I don't know why I am, and God hasn't told me. And so here's what I feel about God. It feels like, he's like this wild beast, and he's trying to hunt me down and really destroy me. Okay? Any questions about verse 9? Okay, let's go on to verse 10. About God, Job is saying, they have gaped at me with their mouth. They have slapped me on the cheek with contempt. They have massed themselves against me. So we're looking at another metaphor here. Mass, of course, is to sort of have a large number of people that are brought together. And so it appears here in verse 10 that Job is accusing God of turning him over to his enemies, so that the enemies can destroy him. Again, we're thinking, well, Job, you're saying some pretty hard-hitting things here, and we need to recognize that if you were in the same pain of agony that he was in, where you're going through the emotional and the psychological aspect of all this happened to him, and then all of the bodily affliction, you can sort of understand Job's coming from. Job has only known God on good terms. God has always just sort of blessed him and took care of him. Everything seemed to be going so well. And then all of a sudden, there's this big turnaround. He's lost all of the blessings, and now he seems to be under God's thumb, and he's just sharing his raw feelings is really what's happening here. Victoria, did you have something you want to say? Okay. Okay, so let's go on to verse 11 here. Job continues, God hands me over to ruffians and tosses me into the hands of the wicked. And a ruffian here, does anybody know what a ruffian is? Maybe your translation reads a little bit different.
Like a troublemaker?
I like the idea of a lawless person. I can remember, I think my dad used to say this every once in a while. I had no idea what it means. But he would say, all right, you ruffians, or something like that, and do this and the other, and like, you know, we were probably in trouble, we were in trouble, and he'd say something like that, so.
Is that similar to like, quit roughhousing?
Well, I don't know, yeah. So, Job uses another metaphor here. This is God's treatment. Job sees God's treatment of himself as if God turned him over to wicked men to treat him however they wished. Again, we're looking at sort of the idea that what Job is saying isn't necessarily true about God, because he does not have God to sort of explain himself to him. But again, the idea is this is how he feels. He's in the suffering. This is the things that are going through his mind as he tries to wrestle with the heaviness of his suffering and have no answer from God. Okay? So, I pointed this out before, and I think it's helpful really for us to understand that, you know, Job is considered, even though it's, you know, a good distance into the Old Testament, it's considered one of the earliest books of the Bible. Sometime it's under the patriarchal age. This is before the time of Moses. Most scholars believe this is more towards the time of Moses, or before Moses, so it's under the patriarchal age. And they didn't have any revelation from God that was written down, and so they had a real basic law, and they didn't have any explanations as to why people suffered. You know, they just sort of had what the generations before them sort of explained to them, what they came to the conclusion, and they only drew one conclusion, and it wasn't all-encompassing of the subject, and that is, if you're suffering, you must have sinned. Verse 12, Job continues, he said, I was at ease, but he's talking about God, shattered me, and he grasped me by the neck and shaken me to pieces. He also set me up as a target. His arrows surround me. Without mercy, he splits my kidney open and pours out my gall in the ground. Obviously, we cannot take this literally, the idea that God sort of literally grabbed him by the neck and shook him. But he's really sort of speaking figuratively of all of the suffering that he has endured. The idea that at one time he was at ease, and the idea is that NIV brings this out really good, New International Version, all was well with me. In other words, life was going well, everything was good. I had my family, you know, life, I was blessed, I had all these things, and then all of it changed. The idea that it was all crushed, it was all shattered, and that God sort of took me and grasped me and shook me to pieces, and really sort of took me down from this position that I was in, the idea that of being in a good place, and really now I'm sort of in shambles. What does he mean there in the latter part of verse 12? He set me up as a target, and he talks about his arrows surround me, and about the idea of his kidneys and his gall. What is he saying about God there? Now this is a metaphor, but what is he really saying there?
That God removed him from the pedestal that he was placed upon.
Okay. He certainly removed him from the place that he was, where he wasn't right. Yeah, he wasn't suffering. He seemed to be in a good standing.
God is unloading his anger on him.
Okay. All right. So the idea is Job, go down range there. I want you to put this target on your chest. Okay, stand there. And that's really what he's saying, is you set me up for target practice. You're taking target practice me. Your arrows are hitting me. It splits my kidneys open, and he pours out my gall on the ground. In other words, God, because he would be a world-class archer, whatever he does is going to be perfect, as he knows right where to aim. He knows to sort of hit the vital organs. And this is very graphic, the idea that this is how he feels. And not that God is literally doing this to him, but imagine really the emotions, the idea that this is how I feel. Because God hasn't explained himself, and God hasn't told me why I went from here to here. I don't know why, but all I do know is that I haven't done anything deserving this. So you can sort of see the predicament Job is in. Okay, verse 14, Job continues about God. He breaks through me with breach after breach. He runs at me like a soldier. What do you think he means there? Another metaphor. So we got to work on.
Kind of relentless.
What's that?
Kind of relentless.
Okay, well, certainly bringing it out. So if you think about what a breach is an opening. And usually it's like an opening in a fortification. And it's really indicative, of what appears to be, God's wrath here. So the idea of it's an opening in the gap of a fortification. So we've got to put all this together. It says Job is sort of presenting himself as if he is sort of like, this walled city. And in ancient times, you want to live in a walled city because
Fortification.
what happens if you don't have a good wall around your city?
You're vulnerable to attack.
Somebody's going to say, hey, let's attack those people and let's take over their cities. We'll take them as slaves and we'll take all their stuff and all that. The idea is you're going to have fortified walls so that you can keep your enemies away and you're going to protect that. But God is going to do something to essentially breach that wall. And we think of what this sort of means. The idea is in ancient times they had what they called a battering ram. And it was a war machine that was built that essentially was designed to break holes in the wall. And so we think about, how modern warfare is. In ancient, they came up with a catapult. They came up with different things to sort of to up the game of warfare. But one of them is these walls sometimes were very, very thick, and they had to come up with a way so they could penetrate them. And really, the battering ram was something that offered them a lot of protection. They could get in this the battering ram, essentially be brought up close and be in this fortified battering ram and basically try to break through the wall, which allows then, of course, large troop movements to sort of get through the hole in the wall. And so Job sees God as sort of like using this battering ram, if you will, and essentially the idea is he's making breach after breach through me, and then once he does that, of course, he runs through like a warrior. Essentially the idea is now he's going to take over because he's broken through. Any questions about verse 14? Okay, now at verse 15 we'll continue. Job says, I have sewed sackcloth over my skin and thrust my horn in the dust. And so from a modern perspective, this is stuff, when we think about Bible study, we're thinking about we would read this, and if we were just reading this, we would have lots of trouble with some of this stuff because we're like, what in the world is he saying? Because he's describing something in words that we would not really use to describe a similar situation. So we have to kind of take it apart a little bit. So when we think about what sackcloth is, anybody have an idea what sackcloth is?
So like a really rough feeling fabric or something?
Yeah, it's been described sort of like a burlap sack. Imagine if you tomorrow morning, instead of putting your regular clothes on, you put on burlap sacks as your clothing. How comfortable you think would that be?
It's very uncomfortable, and you don't stink because burlap smells really bad.
Okay, but it's very coarse material, and it's not comfortable. And what they did in ancient times is they used this material. Nelson's Illustrated Bible Dictionary says it's a rough, coarse cloth or a bag-like garment made of this cloth and worn as a symbol of mourning or repentance. And so the idea, Job is talking about the sackcloth over his skin. And E.W. Bullinger, in his figures of speech used in the Bible and talking about this verse, he talks about the clothing in the sackcloth is put for sorrowing. In other words, Job is indicating the idea that he is in mourning. This is Job's reaction to God's alleged mistreatment of Job, and he is in mourning because, again, the idea is I have no understanding what my God is doing here. All I knew is things were going really well, and now they're about as terrible can be. And I'm sad because I'm trying to understand what I've done to God that could have caused this, because I know that I didn't sin. Okay? So he says, the second part of verse 15 says, and thrust my horn in the dust. Again, these are some challenging things to sort of take apart here. The word horn is in English is from a Hebrew word. Of course, the Old Testament is written in Hebrew. And the word, according to Brown Driver Briggs Hebrew English Lexicon, says that it's figurative of a person. So he's thrust my horn in the dust. The thrusting here, according to Brown Driver Briggs Hebrew English Lexicon, is figurative of humiliation. And so I'm going back to the original language. I'm trying to understand this as it's translated there. And it appears that he's saying, as a result of going into mourning, Job, Job, over God's treatment of him, has been brought very low in humiliation. In other words, it seemed like he was sort of more in this high position as a righteous man. People looked up to Job. And now all of the things that happened to Job is sort of the idea is that he's been brought very low by that. Verse 16, Job says, my face is flushed from weeping, and deep darkness is on my eyelids. Flushed here, you have a different translation. The New International Version, the Amplified Bible says, my face is red. And maybe yours says something like that. And so we're trying to think about what he's saying here. So it seems like that Job is in weeping over God's alleged mistreatment of him has been so great that it has turned his face red, because the idea that he continues to cry and it's really affecting him. And it says that apparently the idea that it has affected his eyesight as well. The intensity of his anguish has affected his eyelids. They have darkened as a result of it. So again, it really shows you, the intensity of all of the mourning and all that's going on through Job. And so it really, Job seems to sort of be kind of a shadow of the person he was before. I mean, he's like a crushed man. He's like a man that has no comforts, not from his friends, not from anything from God, and he is just there to deal with all of it. So Job, he says in verse 17, although there is no violence in my hands, and my prayer is pure. What is Job saying in verse 17? Got to kind of take the whole of it. What is he really saying here?
Basically saying he's innocent.
Okay, very good. So, the word although means in spite of the fact. So the idea that, he's really maintaining his innocence before God. Job is denying any guilt for sin that he's done. He's not saying that I've never sinned, but Job is a righteous man, and a righteous man or a righteous person, when they sin, they repent. And in ancient times, you had to offer up an animal sacrifice. We see that in chapter 1 of Job. And Job has always done this. There's no what we would call outstanding or unrepented of sin that Job knows that he has done to really deserve any of what he's going through. Okay? Any questions about that? We got the last few verses there, 18 through 22. Somebody want to read that? Ryan?
O earth, do not cover my blood, and let there be no resting place for my cry. Even now, behold, my witness is in heaven, and my advocate is on high. My friends are my scoffers, my eye weeps to God. Oh, that a man might plead with God as a man with his neighbor. For when a few years are past, I shall go the way of no return.
All right, so we're dealing with the last bit of what he has to say here of this first speech. And it appears, looking at verse 18, that now he turns his appeal to the earth itself to take note of his declaration of innocence. So the idea is that he doesn't believe that the earth is a person, but really the earth would be a witness that he could call and essentially say that you have seen my life. You know that I'm innocent. And so the idea is you know, I'm calling on the earth to really make my innocence known and stand by that. And he says, and that there be no resting place for my cry. And it seems to be here, the idea is that he is going to make this declaration until he is vindicated that he is a righteous man. Now that's one thing that's missing, is nobody has really vindicated that he's righteous man. We've seen that God does that in heaven in talking to Satan, but that hasn't come out yet in terms of Job's life. He is really what Job says versus what his friend says. 3 friends have told him he's a sinner. Job is one person saying, I'm not a sinner. So there's nobody that has vindicated Job at this point. Verse 19, Job says, even now, behold, my witness is in heaven, and my advocate is on high. What is an advocate?
Someone who stands up for you.
What's that?
Someone who stands up for you.
Okay, that's pretty good. Yeah, the idea is somebody sort of represents your interests, somebody is there. And so now Job turns his attention from essentially the earth sort of being, you know, an appeal for to be a witness. And he says, my witness is in heaven and my advocate is on high. And the translators, most of them have the word advocate in the English here with a small a. So it doesn't appear that they seem to have God primarily in view, but sort of the place of heaven. And so heaven sort of being representative of God. Job will call on heaven itself to bear witness to his innocence. This is a possible allusion to God himself, but heaven would know the truth of this matter in relation to Job's innocence. Heaven would be able to declare Job's innocence as well. Okay? Let's go on to verse 20. Job says, my friends are my scoffers, and my eye weeps to God. Okay? Think about those friends. Now they're, you know, Eliphaz and the other ones, they're hearing this, and the idea of, why would he call them scoffers? I mean, that's some pretty hard-hitting words there. What is a scoffer, by the way? What's that?
Well, they're kind of mocking him, or not. They don't believe him.
They don't believe him. Okay, so the idea is if you're not going to be in Job's corner, in other words, Job, we don't care what you're telling us. Let us tell you what we think the situation is. We think that you're guilty of sin and you're paying the price for it, and we think you're acting like a hypocrite because you're saying that you're innocent and you're going through the suffering, and that's what that suffering means. You sin, Job. And so the idea is his friends, because they see him as somebody who is hypocritical, somebody who is trying to declare as innocent but really isn't, they have essentially chosen the road really in their speeches to really mock Job as a righteous man. And that's got to be hard to hear that, especially when you know that you're innocent. You know the idea is, I thought you were my friends. I thought you guys really cared about me. I thought when I spoke to you and I said whatever I said, you would understand that I would tell you the truth. And I've been pouring my heart out to you guys. I've been telling you the truth. And look at what I'm getting for it. The idea that you're mocking me. And so as a result of the friends' false conclusion they have drawn about Job, that he is suffering by the hand of God as a result of unrepentant sin, they ignore his pleas for understanding and ignore his declaration of innocence. They have no sympathy for him, and they ridicule him because in their minds, Job is a prideful sinner. Isn't that terrible? I mean, that's just sort of where they're at, and Job is sort of there by himself. And so we can then understand why the second part of verse 20 says, my eye weeps to God. You know, God has not explained himself. But God, in Job's eyes, is somebody that can really see his heart and really knows the place of pain that he is. And God would know that he's an innocent man. And I kind of like what Barnes Notes says. So that's a commentary in the book of Job. He says, talking about my eye weeps to God, he says, quote, despised and mocked by his friends, he, that is Job, made his appeal to one who knew would regard him with compassion. This shows that the heart of Job was substantially right, notwithstanding all his passionate exclamations and notwithstanding his expressions when he was urged on by his sorrows to give vent to improper emotions in relation to God. Yet he had a firm confidence in him and always turned to right feelings and views. The heart may sometimes err. The best of people may sometimes give expression to improper feelings, but they will return to just views and will ultimately evince unwavering confidence in God, unquote. Let's go on to verse 21. Oh, that a man might plead with God as a man with his neighbor. You know, Job is talking about the idea of courtroom situation with God in previous chapters and speeches. The idea is this: I would like a court date with God. I would like to stand before him. I would like to present my case to him and declare my innocence and let God explain to me, you know, sort of why this is happening here. But here's a different approach that Job seems to be here. Is the idea is this, you know, it would be nice essentially to be able to deal with God as a man with his neighbor. Job seems to be saying that he'd like to deal with a situation in which he's suffering like a situation between neighbors and sort of work out things fairly between them. Verse 22, Job says, for when a few years are past, I shall go the way of no return. Job, who had previously been wishing that God would take his life, and this is pretty serious. You think, well, Job just didn't sprain his pinky. This is pretty heavy duty stuff. The idea that he's wishing that God would just end his life because he's in so much misery and agony, now is saying here that if he had to continue to live in the suffering day to day, now indicates that he anticipates living a few years more before he dies. The words following verse 21 suggest that Job may not be vindicated while he's in this life on earth, but that he will be vindicated after by God himself in the afterlife. Any questions or comments regarding that? Okay. If not, I got a few quick applications here, and then we'll finish up. Just kind of taking this, in other words, we spent a lot of time looking at this tonight, and we think, well, you know, how does that benefit me today? I mean, I've listened to all this, and I sort of get the idea Job was suffering, friends weren't sympathetic, I got all this stuff here. How is anything, what sort of applications can we make from this? So I want just to share with you a few, since we're up against the clock here. One of the applications is that sometimes trials in life are very hard. We should not think that just because you're a Christian, you don't have to go through trial in your life. James is going to talk about that in James chapter 1, where he's going to talk about trials in life. But sometimes those trials are very hard. Even though Job was where he was at, the idea is even though God had confidence that he would prevail and he would be faithful to God even through the worst of suffering, for Job it was a trial of his faith. And sometimes those trials can be very hard. A second application that we might make is we ought to, as Christians, support one another in times of trial without fail. You know, we mentioned Romans chapter 12 and verse 15 earlier, that we're to weep with those who weep. And the idea as Christians, we should be sympathetic to each other. Not only should we rejoice in times of rejoicing, but the idea is we should support each other in times of difficulties and trials. A third application I think we can make here is that although we might not always understand why God allows trials in our lives, this we can be confident of is that they are never done to discourage us or to hurt us. Going back to James, the idea is they're to strengthen our faith. So A lot of times Christians, they get in a trial and they think, well, why me? And it's the wrong question to ask. Well, because God wants you to go through the trial. The question is what am I supposed to get from this? And the idea is we know the basic purpose of the trial is to make us stronger in our faith. Then we can maybe hone in really on the particulars of what we're going through and say, oh, maybe God is trying to teach me this as I'm going this particular trial. But the bottom line is He's trying to strengthen my faith. And the fourth application is sometimes righteous people suffer in this life. Some people might think, well, if you become a Christian, you're never going to have to go through hard times at all. And that just isn't the truth. We can look at what Paul suffered. We can see Jesus himself suffering. We can see Christians suffering. In the first century, there were certainly those in the Old Testament who were righteous that suffered. We're going to do that in this life as well. And best thing we can do is be prepared to endure for Christ. Okay. Any prayer requests before we finish up tonight? I want to thank those who are watching the video. Will watch the video. Hopefully you'll be able to tune in for another one next Wednesday. God bless you.